Thank you everybody for joining us for our last webinar of the year. And as everybody knows, it's been quite the year. And for those of us who have been working for peace, we've been both incredibly terrified by the prospect of war, but also deeply heartened by the outpouring of organizing, dedication and support for a peaceful and diplomatic solution to the ongoing tensions on the Korean Peninsula. In response to North Korea's missile tests last week, we heard H.R. McMaster, Trump's national security advisor, say that as North Korea perfects its ability to strike the United States with a nuclear-tipped missile, that we get closer to war. So this seems both a critical moment to stop a potential war, but also pivot towards a long-term solution to the 65-year-old conflict. So that's why today we have an amazing webinar with a brilliant, brilliant legal scholar who is going to explore the legal document that defines the relationship between Washington and Pyongyang, the Armistice Agreement. Many of you may know this, but on July 27th, 1953, military commanders from the United States, on behalf of the UN Command, North Korea and China, signed the Armistice Agreement, which temporarily halted the 1950 to 53 Korean War, which claimed up to 4 million lives. And Article 4, Paragraph 60 of the Armistice Agreement called for replacing this temporary ceasefire with a peace treaty within 90 days. And as we know, 65 years later, that agreement has never been signed. So as we know, war basically defines relationships between the United States and North Korea and has arrested progress towards reconciliation, healing, and obviously the eventual reunification of the two Koreas. So we're deeply honored to have Dr. Henri Feron, who will provide a critical overview of this important legal document that has shaped peace and development on the Korean Peninsula, and discuss with us the necessary steps needed to transition towards peace treaty. If it's okay, I'm just going to quickly read his very impressive bio. Henri is a postdoctoral research scholar for the Center for Korean Legal Studies at Columbia Law School. He holds a PhD in Science of Law from Tsinghua University in Beijing, China. He also holds an LLM from Columbia University and an LLM in Chinese law from Tsinghua University, as well as a double LLB in French and English law from University Paris in Panthéon-Sorbonne and King's College in London. His research focuses on nuclear weapons law, oceans law, international human rights law, and East Asian legal studies. He's the co-editor of Pathways to a Peaceful Korean Peninsula, just published last year, in which he wrote the chapter proposing a model of reunification to solve the Korean nuclear crisis. His other works include the Philippines versus China jurisdictional award and its implications for the Republic of Korea, and the Chinese model of human rights, and Doom and Gloom, or Economic Boom, the myth of the North Korean collapse. He's currently working in partnership with the Korean Institute of National Unification to co-edit a book provisionally entitled Precarious Equilibrium, East Asian Power Dynamics, and the Question of Peace in Korea. If there were anybody that is better suited to help us understand the Armistice Agreement, we are just so delighted and honored to have Henri. So Henri, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to hand it off to you now.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. So as Christine mentioned, the presentation I'm about to give today is about the legal issues and implications related to a treaty in Korea. As this is going on YouTube, I'd like to make clear start that this is not a presentation about advocating for or against a peace treaty. That is a subject that is a different subject, and a subject on which everybody can make their minds up for themselves if they haven't already. So what I will be doing is provide a legal analysis of the arguments made for or against the peace treaty to elevate the debate really by dispelling a lot of the rampant confusion about what such a treaty would mean legally. For instance, opponents to a peace treaty may argue that it legally implies recognizing North Korea as a nuclear weapons state or dissolving the US-ROK alliance. Conversely, proponents might argue that peace with North Korea legally implies the withdrawal of US troops or reunification of the Koreas. I'll argue that actually none of these points are necessary legal implications of a peace treaty. From a legal perspective, peace is just the end of a state of war between two or more state belligerents. So it insists in drastically raising the bar on what sort of conduct is lawful between those states. There has traditionally been a distinction in international law between two bodies of law related to war: the law on the use of force and the law of armed conflict. Now, the law on the use of force determines when one can legally enter into a war and use force, which is essentially restricted today to situations of self-defense or legitimate Security Council authorization. The law of armed conflict determines what sort of force you may use in war. For instance, it's generally prohibited to attack civilians. The two bodies of law are kept distinct because once war is started, arguments about whether the first shot fired was lawful or not become much less relevant than ensuring that all shots fired thereafter don't target non-combatants, for example. What a peace treaty does, simply said, is makes the question of the first shot relevant again. It decreases tension by returning the signatories to a state where the threat or the use of force is clearly illegal outside of cases of self-defense or Security Council or a new Security Council authorization. So, structure of the presentation I'm going to give today, first looking at the structure of the Armistice Agreement, then looking at how the Armistice Agreement has collapsed or is collapsing, depending on your view, and attempts at peace historically, then turning to relevant legal issues to get to a peace treaty, and finally suggestions before conclusion. So, turning over to the first part, the structure of the Armistice Agreement. The Armistice Agreement is divided into 5 articles and preamble. There's numerous paragraphs in it. The preamble does it makes clear that the Armistice Agreement is an agreement between military commanders. This matters insofar as it raises questions about how binding it is to governments. It also signals that the Armistice Agreement was meant to be temporary, that peace was supposed to be formalized by governments soon thereafter. Article 1 delineates the military demarcation line, basically the border between the two Koreas, and establishes the regime of the demilitarized zone, the DMZ. So that's the buffer zone around the demarcation line. The most notable provision here is neither side shall execute any hostile acts within, from, or against the DMZ. That's the provision that's pointed to when shots are fired in the DMZ. Most important omission in Article 1 is the delimitation of the West Sea, which gave rise to the Northern Line maritime boundary dispute. Article 2 is the core of the Armistice Agreement. It defines the zones of control. It defines the ceasefire obligations. It establishes the Military Armistice Commission, the MAC, and the Neutral Nations Supervisory Committee, the NNSC. So the key provisions establish that the commander of each side should enforce a complete cessation of hostilities by forces under their control, and crucially that they should cease the introduction of reinforcing military personnel and equipment, except for rotation and replacement. Then the NNSC, the Nation Supervisory Commission, is composed of officers that were considered neutral nations at that point, or was composed of officers that were considered neutral nations at that point, that is Sweden, Switzerland, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. It was meant to supervise the absence of reinforcements. So they were disposed in ports, and they were looking at what was flowing in and out of Korea. The Military Armistice Commission is composed of the belligerents. So on the one side, you'd have North Korean and Chinese general, on the other side, the UNC general. And that was supposed to supervise the implementation of the Armistice Agreement by the means of communication and settle through negotiations any violations, possibly ask for an inspection by an NSC. Article 3 is about POWs. I won't go into that because that's not the subject today. So I'll skip that. Article 4 is about peace treaty transition. There's only a single paragraph in Article 4, and it basically recommends to, quote unquote, the governments concerned on both sides without specifying who those governments are, to convene talks for a peace treaty negotiation within 3 months of July 1953. And finally, Article 5 is a standard closing article in treaties, basically defining how do you amend, how do you abrogate, when does it come into effect. Most notable provision here is that states that the Armistice Agreement should remain into force until superseded by mutually acceptable amendments or a peaceful settlement at the political level. This brings us to the question of whether the Armistice Agreement is still in force today. The fact that the Armistice Agreement is signed by military commanders rather than governments and has not been ratified according to constitutional processes muddles how legally binding this document is. Could be argued that it was not even binding in the first place, since it's never been ratified. The counter argument to that is that it has been treated as binding by both sides, and so that it became actually binding not as a matter of the law of treaties, but of customary law. Arguing that the Armistice Agreement is still binding on that basis, on a customary basis, rests on demonstrating that its provisions have been respected most of the time, continue to be observed, they're treated as law, and act in accordance. But apart from respect for the demarcation line and restraint interesting, most of the major operating parts of the Armistice Agreement have broken down. The first obvious part to break down was the obligation to follow up with negotiations for peace treaty. There has not been a negotiation within 3 months. It was within 8. It was at the Geneva Conference. And the Geneva Conference famously also handled the Indochina War, or the first Indochina War. There was an attempt to peace in Korea, about Korea, at that time too, but it failed for reasons that I'll go into in the next slide. But basically, this part of the Armistice Agreement has broken down because there has not been a proper peace conference since then. The second part to break down was the SC. In 1956, South Korea and the United States pressured for the withdrawal of Polish and Czech inspection teams from South Korean ports and expelled them from the DMZ, from South Korean ports to the DMZ. So they could not get out of the DMZ. This prompted North Korea to mirror these actions with some Swedes on its side. And without the means to monitor reinforcements violating the Armistice Agreement, the NNSC really became an empty shell. It couldn't fill its main purpose. Ultimately, North Korea took the view that NSC had collapsed, and finally, in 1995, it disavowed the Czech and Polish supervisors left at the DMZ because both countries, Poland and the Czech Republic, had joined NATO. The third part to break down was the provision of reinforcements, right after the breaking down of the NSC, really. the US announced in 1957 that it no longer considered itself bound by that provision, and it introduced tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea at the latest by 1958. The fourth part to break down was the Military Armistice Commission. In 1991, South Korean general was put in charge of the UNC side of the Military Armistice Commission, other than a US general as before. And North Korea decided to withdraw and boycott the Military Armistice Commission henceforth, arguing that South Korea was not a signatory to the Armistice Agreement and therefore had no right to be there. North Korea instead established a liaison office in Panmunjom. China stayed on for 3 years and then finally withdrew, saying that Military Armistice Commission had become inoperative and calling for peace treaty. Today, the Military Armistice Commission still exists, or rather, it's really the UNC side meeting with it. So all these parts have broken down, and North Korea since 1994 has repeatedly said that it considered the Armistice Agreement abrogated, or not. It didn't consider itself bound anymore. It repeatedly asked for a peace treaty to replace it, but didn't feel bound. The US and South Korea insist the Armistice Agreement is still in force, and they continue to list all purported violations. Now, the problem with arguing that the Armistice Agreement is still in force is that it can actually always get out of international treaties in case of fundamental change of circumstance or material breach of the treaty by the other side. So you cannot really keep a country against its will in a treaty, really. Since the Armistice Agreement is not even a proper treaty because it didn't go through ratification processes, and since North Korea repeatedly called out the other side on fundamental changes, on material breaches, that plausibly empty the Armistice Agreement of substance. The argument that it is force and binding is, in my view, rather weak. That brings us to the question, how do we transition then to a peace treaty? Whether or not the Armistice Agreement is still in force, you need to transition to, to transition to a peace treaty, the questions remain the same. So I'll first outline some of the historical background on attempts at peace. So the first attempt, as mentioned before, the Geneva Conference in 1954. 7 months after signature of the Armistice Agreements, the Geneva Conference was convened to settle the Korean War and the First Indochina War. It was more successful in Indochina than in Korea. On Indochina, it resulted in the retreat of France from Indochina, the creation of North and South Vietnam, but nothing for Korea. The two sides of the Korean War disagreed on 2 key points: whether foreign troops should be allowed to stay in Korea, and how elections in a reunified Korea should proceed. North Korea and China proposed that foreign forces leave first, and then there be elections throughout Korea, supervised by a joint South-North electoral commission. However, South Korea and the US insisted that Chinese forces withdraw, while UNC forces stay as police force, and that elections be under UN procedures, as it had happened in the ROK. North Korea and China refused, and so such an outcome would have seemed to them more or less that of a UNC victory, the war. They proposed instead a compromise, an electoral supervision commission made out of neutral countries, a little bit like the NNSC. This was rejected by the ROK US, and there was no other agreements or other proposals that were set forth. So the Geneva Conference failed to produce a peace treaty. The next important development in that respect is in the 1970s. It was a diplomatic showdown at the United Nations General Assembly on the issue of peace and reunification in Korea. Just the critical resolution being the General Assembly Resolution 3390, and that came just 7 months after Vietnam's unification. So while the UN in the 1950s was an organization that was dominated by Western interests, mass entry of decolonized countries in the UN and the entry of the People's Republic of China at the Security Council fundamentally changed the balance of power. I wouldn't say that it dominated the UN, but it changed the balance of power. And so North Korean activism at that time to get to a peace treaty culminated in the adoption of that resolution 3390. It's highly worth reading. I invite everybody to read it for themselves because it's full of nuances that are very revealing about the nature of the peace treaty debate. In part B of that resolution, the General Assembly called for the dissolution of the UN, the United Nations Command. It calls for the withdrawal of foreign troops from Korea, the replacement of an armistice agreement with a peace treaty, and a drastic reduction of armed forces on both sides to equal levels. However, counter-activism by South Korea and the United States meant that Part A, that resolution, supported by different countries than Part B, insisted that the Armistice Agreement should stay in place until peace negotiations succeed. So basically, you have one side insisting on the urgency of a peace treaty, and the other side insisting on maintaining the status quo until necessary changes have been made. In any case, the momentum of this General Assembly charm offensive was broken by the so-called axe murder incident in 1976, in which a brawl in the DMZ of North Korean soldiers culminated in the death of 2 Americans and drastically raised tensions at the DMZ, and there was no talk of peace anymore. Note, however, that the charm offensive, I mention it here because it led to a fundamental structural change regarding the presence of US troops in Korea, namely the creation of the CFC, the Combined Forces Command, which would contribute to legitimize continued US presence, even if a peace treaty was signed. I'll address this in the next slide. In any case, the next important development in attempts to achieve a peace treaty is North Korea's nuclear weapon development. North Korea presents its nuclear weapons program as the direct consequence of the decades-long US refusal to agree to a peace treaty. So far as this refusal suggests to North Korea that Washington still bears hostile intents towards it. From the start, North Korea made clear that it will not stop developing nuclear weapons if it does not get security assurances in the form of peace and normalization talks with the United States. It's something it has asked for in the Agreed Framework of 1994. It's something it has asked for the 6-party talks, and whenever denuclearization was brought up thereafter. For a long time, the debate in the US and South Korea has been centered on whether all this talk of peace was just a pretext for nuclear blackmail, whether North Korea's real objective was simply about earning aid for refraining from developing nuclear weapons. And North Korea has only suffered sanctions and not really received any aid for 10 years now. It's not even, to my knowledge, asking for aid anymore, only for a peace treaty. So I'm not sure to what extent that analysis connects with the facts that we have now. The main difference with what we are facing today compared to the Agreed Framework era is that North Korea at that time, in 1994, was ready to give up its nuclear program, or at least it said so. Now it doesn't. It says it will only freeze it rather than dismantle it, unless perhaps the US denuclearizes as well. But in any case, the difference, I believe, can be explained by North Korea now feeling it is in a much stronger bargaining position than it was in 1994, economically and militarily. At the time, it was basically on the verge of collapse. And now it feels that it has enough leverage to de-link peace and nuclear issue. From the perspective of South Korea, however, the nuclear issue derailed reunification talks by fundamentally changing the balance of power between North Korea and South Korea. When progressive presidents first came to power in South Korea with Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, the movement for reunification largely operated under the assumption that North Korea would eventually denuclearize. The fact that it didn't led South Korea to adopt a hawkish attitude to North Korea, or be more sensitive to hawkish arguments, and reverse progress on reunification. Perhaps one worry was that North Korea's nuclear weapons exposed South Korea to nuclear blackmail in any bilateral negotiations, and make South Korea more dependent on the US nuclear umbrella, and therefore that much more sensitive to US national interests. Since North Korea declared it would not denuclearize, this makes it exceptionally difficult for a South Korean president to proceed on reunification unless A, the US concludes a peace treaty, or B, South Korea develops its own nuclear weapons to negotiate bilaterally with North Korea on equal playing field. This conundrum explains why since 2013, at least about 2/3 of South Koreans say they support their country developing their own nuclear weapons. Now, going on to the legal issues for peace treaty. There are many legal issues that would be relevant, but the ones that I've chosen to cover here are whether there are any preconditions for peace treaty, because that's a topic that comes up often. Who needs to sign, because that's not clear. And then some of the points that I mentioned in the introduction, whether a peace treaty entails recognition of North Korea, whether it entails reunification, whether it entails withdrawal of US troops, whether it entails an end to the US-RK alliance, what does it mean to be a nuclear weapons state? So first, is there any legal precondition or required form for peace treaty? I'd say no, there is no legal precondition. And no, there is no specific form apart from that is generally applicable to any treaty. Any preconditions to a peace treaty are purely political. For instance, when the US says denuclearization is a precondition for talk, it's not a legal condition. It's an expression of US political priorities. As for form, typically, as mentioned before, a treaty has to be signed by a government representative with an appropriate delegation of power and must then be ratified according to the country's constitutional process. In the US, typically, that means approval by 2/3 of the Senate. Now, who needs to sign? A peace treaty does not require ratification by all belligerents to be effective. Two belligerents may separately make peace as between themselves. For instance, in the San Francisco Peace Treaty ended World War II as between Japan and the United States and several other countries, but not as between Japan and the Soviet Union or Japan and Japan. Now, for Korean peace treaty to have a meaningful effect in decreasing tensions and ending hostilities, it should include North Korea. It was a belligerent, and it is the most vocal in demanding a peace treaty, and it's well, it's just not going away from that. Next, it should include the United States, as the belligerent North Korea wants assurances from. The argument is sometimes made that the US has no business signing such a peace treaty because the troops fighting for South in the Korean War were fighting under the umbrella of the United Nations Command. And so the argument that a Korean peace treaty would instead require a signature from perhaps the Secretary General or a resolution by the Security Council. Several Secretary Generals have, however, made clear that the UN never had any say in commanding the UNC. Instead, the UNC was always directly under command of the US president, at least in that chain of command. It is a UN entity, it's not a UN entity. Signing a peace treaty therefore only makes sense with a US signature. China's signature is not strictly necessary, insofar as at the time, it sent a volunteer army, not its national army, the People's Liberation Army. And also, it has normalized relations with the US in 1979 and with South Korea in 1992. So it's not strictly legally necessary for it to increase tension. South Korea's signature, while not legally required, because as said, you can end as soon as you have two belligerents. I mean, you can make a peace treaty as soon as you have two belligerents. So while not legally required, would be politically difficult to exclude. A US-North Korea bilateral peace treaty, excluding South Korea, would be difficult to explain to Americans, to South Koreans, and to US allies, because it could be misinterpreted as the US giving up protecting South Korea against North Korea. On the other hand, including South Korea may raise certain legal problems because North Korea and South Korea are both reluctant to recognize each other as separate states. I'll address those problems a little bit later, how they can be addressed. So, does a peace treaty legally recognize North Korea as a state and or require Korean reunification? So yes, a peace treaty would require recognition of North Korea as a state for the US, not necessarily for South Korea. And no, it does not require Korean reunification. What I mean by that is, first, recognition of North Korea as a state would be required for a peace treaty to have full effect as an international treaty protected by the law of treaties. There is, to my knowledge, no US law that prevents recognition of North Korea as a state. Moreover, North Korea has already been recognized as a UN member state since 1991, jointly with South Korea. So there should not be a problem on US side. From a South Korean perspective, both South and North actually have domestic laws that prevent them from recognizing each other as separate states. However, the two have found ways around it to conclude in Korean agreements, for instance, on Kaesong. So the trick would be to apply the same change of terminology, really, here. So one way to address this in the context of a peace treaty negotiation, to make two instruments. One now North Korea-US peace treaty, and one North-South Korea inter-Korean peace agreement. You'd have to look at terminology required under the two laws, but I think that's something that's viable. If you negotiate them in parallel, also it means that there is no different balance of power dynamics. As for reunification, the cessation of hostilities between the two Koreas, I believe, does not legally trigger the reunification process, even though there will be strong political momentum for it. Both Koreas are constitutionally required to seek reunification, but the legal obligation created in these clauses is so vague as to become nearly meaningless, because either side can insist on a view of reunification that they know is unacceptable to the other. That way they can stall the process without violating the constitution. Because of the weakness of this obligation, there is, in my view, no obligation to start the reunification process as soon as peace is concluded. The two issues can be separated and might not be that bad because the two are extremely complicated. Mixing them up may make it impossible to get to peace. In any case, does a peace treaty, next question is, does a peace treaty legally require US troop withdrawal or dissolve the US-ROK alliance? No and no. A peace treaty does not require US troop withdrawal, and it does not dissolve the US-ROK alliance. It might have done so until 1978. The legal justification of troop presence in Korea after their initial withdrawal in 1948 was tightly linked to Security Council resolutions 82, 83, and 84, which called for UN members to assist South Korea against North Korean invasion by putting troops under the unit of command of the United States. Signing a peace treaty would have removed this key justification for the presence of US troops in South Korea. In 1978, however, the US and South Korean government diluted that link by transferring operational control of US Forces Korea and of the South Korean Armed Forces from the so-called UNC, United Nations Command, to the so-called CFC, Combined Forces Command. The chain of command is different insofar as the CFC chain of command is supposed to be shared between the US and South Korean government, and it's based on the US-RK bilateral security treaty. It does not contain any mention of war and peace, basically. It's not linked legally to whether there is peace or not in Korea. It's a matter of US and South Korean bilateral relations. As a result, the issue of peace in Korea and that of US troop presence are legally distinct. A peace treaty does not imply US troop withdrawal, but it also does not imply the dissolution of the US-RK legally, because it's not impossible that the US would make political threats in that direction if it felt that negotiations were not going its way. And the South Korean public is knowingly very sensitive to those sorts of arguments. Final question: does a peace treaty legally recognize North Korea as a quote-unquote nuclear weapons state or lift sanctions? So I'd say no. A peace treaty does not legally recognize North Korea as a nuclear weapons state in the sense of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and no, it's not required the lifting of non-proliferation sanctions. The designation nuclear weapons state in the context of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which is the main treaty against the development of nuclear weapons. So the designation nuclear weapons state in that treaty refers to a specific group of 5 countries that are allowed to maintain nuclear weapons even though they're a member of the NPT. Those 5 countries, unsurprisingly, are China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the US. All other members of the NPT are called non-nuclear weapon states, and they have the obligation not to develop nuclear weapons. What they get in return is access to civilian nuclear technology and material from the other NPT members, and a promise from the nuclear weapon states that they would negotiate towards disarmament. That was 50 years ago, but that was what was supposed to be at the basis of the grand bargain of the NPT. The mere fact of developing nuclear weapons, like North Korea does not make a country a nuclear weapons state under the NPT. And this will not change whether or not there is a peace treaty in Korea, and this will not change whether or not North Korea puts in its constitution. So false debate, really, because just to call itself a nuclear weapon state does not have any legal implications outside of the NPT. North Korea has anyway declared withdrawal from the NPT in 2003, and while there was some initial controversy about whether that withdrawal was legal, that was largely put to rest when Russia, as a treaty depository for North Korea, recognized the withdrawal. So what I'm saying is that denuclearization and the issue of being recognized as a nuclear weapons state or not is a distinct issue from the peace treaty. They don't have a legal implication for one another. Even if there is peace, North Korea, unless an according provision is inserted in the peace treaty, North Korea will continue to be shut out from nuclear trade with NPT members because it is not itself an NPT member, and it may still be subject to non-proliferation sanctions by the Security Council. So having gone through these 5 questions, I think we're ready now for certain suggestions on what a peace treaty would look like. And originally I planned to talk about confidence building measures and demining the DMZ and all that, but I think there's a lot more peace veterans that would be better placed for that than me. What I wanted to focus on here is specifically issues that are specific to a peace treaty for Korea. The key point here is that North Korea's main ask is normalization of relations with the US. What does that mean in legal terms? It could mean a number of things. Probably it means mutual diplomatic representation. That's not a necessary implication of a peace treaty, but it's something that would make sense insofar as it would greatly contribute to events that tensions flare up again. One other thing that it could mean is the lifting of unilateral sanctions. Or rather, let me backtrack a little bit to talk about mutual diplomatic representation in the context of the two Koreas. Here too, it's just a matter of terminology. If they don't want to recognize each other as a separate state, they can still send representatives to each other and call them differently, like a chargé d'affaires or an envoy or what's the representative, whatever makes them feel comfortable with being internally coherent. So basically, mutual diplomatic representation should not be really an issue, and it should be something that is really conducive to decrease tensions. So it's a reasonable ask, and it's something that I think should be in a peace treaty. As for the lifting of unilateral sanctions, anything that goes beyond Security Council sanctions probably should be lifted. Insofar as if one wants to decrease tensions, one needs to recognize that from the perspective of North Korea, unilateral sanctions that are not linked, or even those that are linked to its nuclear weapons, but unilateral sanctions from the United States are seen as an evidence of hostile intent. To that extent, if one wants to show by a peace treaty that there will be no hostile intent, no more hostilities, then those sanctions probably need to go. And I don't see North Korea staying in negotiation with the perspective of those sanctions staying on the table. If the Banco Delta Asia affair is any guide to that. Now, when one comes to the lifting of non-proliferation sanctions, so that's sanctions that are specifically targeted at making North Korea abandon its nuclear weapons. Those are distinct from unilateral sanctions that, for example, the US might have put on banks that deal with North Korea and are shut out from using dollars because they're suspected of money laundering for North Korea. That's a different set of sanctions. Most of the non-proliferation sanctions are those that are listed in the Security Council resolutions that have been adopted against North Korea. The US has insisted for a quarter century that it would not talk about peace if North Korea does not first denuclearize. And meanwhile, since the failure of the Agreed Framework and the six-party talks, North Korea has made repeatedly clear that it is not ready to denuclearize, even in exchange for a peace treaty, only to freeze at current levels. Now, non-proliferation is a legitimate concern of the international community. If North Korea is allowed to get and to keep nuclear weapons, it's likely that South Korea and Japan will also get some. On the other hand, it's not clear that North Korea is violating international law by developing nuclear weapons, as other countries have done before. Customary international law does not prohibit the development of nuclear weapons, and North Korea is not bound by NPT obligations anymore. So the only factor that really makes North Korean weapons illegal are Security Council resolutions. North Korea does have a legitimate argument that these sanctions are themselves illegal to the extent that the Security Council is overstepping its authority under the UN Charter by infringing on North Korea's inherent right of self-defense. The problem with accepting that line of reasoning, though, is that it would be highly destabilizing for the world order. It would mark the first time a country successfully defies the Security Council, dealing a blow to its authority. You could have all sorts of countries beyond the Northeast Asian theater decide to develop nuclear weapons, even against Security Council opposition. Or Iran, Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, Vietnam. So to sum up, on the one hand, North Korea will not denuclearize. On the other hand, letting it keep nuclear weapons and lifting all non-proliferation sanctions will be highly destabilizing. And that's basically where everybody gets stuck. So some think that maybe it's time that a country show the limits of the legitimacy and authority of the Security Council as an oligarchy maintained by force. Some may think that it's time the country show that there is no justice in letting 5 permanent members keep their weapons while preventing others from joining the club. And that the non-proliferation system will fail sooner or later anyway if those 5 continue to refuse disarmament. Some may think that it's time to let other countries like South Korea get their own nuclear weapons to decide their fate without being really at the mercy of nuclear umbrella holders. But you just cannot realistically expect US negotiators to allow all this by agreeing to a peace treaty with North Korea that lifts all sanctions against the country. No president will want to take the blame for such a momentous decision, especially since we don't know what the world would look like after that. In these circumstances, the only way I see a peace treaty happening is by not making either side lose peace. Basically, you let North Korea have nuclear weapons, but still maintain Security Council sanctions against it. Anyway, the United States cannot promise in a peace treaty the lifting of Security Council sanctions because that also depends on the will of the other Security Council members. At least that maintains the authority of the Security Council and the credibility of the non-proliferation system. It will still be hard to prevent South Korea and Japan from developing nuclear armament in response. But other countries can perhaps still be deterred for a time from joining the nuclear club. Because the nature of the deal on nuclear weapons, how it all turns out, will profoundly affect what will be required in terms of confidence building measures for conventional forces. I don't really intend to go very deeply into that. I'll just signal that North Korea has in the past repeatedly proposed a parallel reduction of conventional forces to as little as 100,000 troops on each side. That was a different time and period, though, and 100,000 troops with nuclear weapons is not the same as 100,000 troops without nuclear weapons. So again, South Korea is likely to want its own nuclear weapons if a peace treaty with North Korea lets North Korea keep its own. I'll skip the northern limit line because I think we're kind of running out of time. But basically, the northern limit line, quick solution, either you have a joint development zone. Roh Moo-hyun tried that and he got attacked a lot for it. Or you send the issue to the International Court of Justice. If you send the issue to the International Court of Justice, North Korea will probably win because the northern limit line is unilaterally traced. It's very difficult to reconcile with the current state of international law. But it's a topic that I don't want to get too far into without adding all the nuance that would be necessary. So basically, jumping to the conclusion. First, the Armistice Agreement broke down in almost all its main operating part. It's not being followed up by successful peace negotiations. The Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission was preventing from fulfilling its main role. The prohibition of reinforcements has been ignored, and the Military Armistice Commission is a shell where one side basically meets itself. As a result, North Korea said it does not consider itself bound by it anymore, and there's really no point in an armistice agreement to which only one side holds on to. Second, there are no legal preconditions to conclude a peace treaty. Any preconditions are political. All you need is a signature by appropriate government representatives and ratification for it to become legally binding as an international treaty. Third, a peace treaty should be signed by at least North Korea and the US. China's signature is not legally required. South Korea is not legally necessary, but it will be politically difficult to exclude. And the most straightforward way to reconcile the fact that the North and South Korea don't want to recognize each other as separate states is you make two different treaties of a different nature, but of same substance. So basically a peace treaty, international treaty with the US, and an inter-Korean agreement with South Korea. For a peace treaty does not mean that a reunification process kicks in. Peace and reunification are distinct issues. Mixing them up can make things more difficult than they are already, because nobody agrees on what reunification should look like. Fourth, a peace treaty has no direct legal impact on the presence of US troops in Korea. That's a matter of South Korea-US bilateral relations. This presence is not tied to peace or war. It's based on an alliance treaty. The peace treaty has also no direct legal implications on the alliance treaty itself. Again, the US could threaten to withdraw from it, or to withdraw US troops, or to withdraw from the treaty. That's a political move, but it could do it. So the distinction between legal and political is important. South Korea will be vulnerable to those threats as long as it is military dependent on the US. Fifth, for a peace treaty to meaningfully diminish tensions, it should probably at least require mutual diplomatic representation and the lifting of unilateral sanctions not mandated by the Security Council. The only way to personally see reconciling of North Korea's insistence on keeping its nuclear weapons and the US's insistence that it may not keep its nuclear weapons, it's just to make neither side lose face by letting those nuclear weapons there and letting the sanctions in place too. There could be a mechanism by which, after the peace treaty, if North Korea wants to get rid of the sanctions, they could gradually denuclearize, and so that in that way you would have a phased nuclearization. But in any case, delinking the issues of peace and denuclearization will be politically highly challenging, because that runs counter to what South Korea and the US have said for a long time, and risks pushing South Korea to nuclearize itself. It's just that the outcome is not unimaginable. Proliferation can still arguably be contained to the Northeast Asian theater, just like India-Pakistan proliferation was contained to the South Asian theater. In any case, there's no realistic outcome to the Korean nuclear crisis today, in my eyes, that leads to less nuclear weapons. Letting the situation fester leads to more North Korean nuclear weapons and still risks provoking South Korea and Japan into getting their own. It may be better for this to happen with peace treaty than without them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henri. That it was really comprehensive, and I have tons of questions, and I see some questions have come in. And for those that are watching via Facebook, should probably type in your questions, and we also have some from the Zoom. So let me get started. I actually have a few questions I wanted to ask, and then I'll include the questions from the listeners. Can you tell me about, so what's interesting is that the US is in response to North Korea's missile tests. The State Department released a statement that said that the US would be co-convening with Canada a meeting of the UN Command next month in Vancouver. And I'm just curious, I appreciated the point that you made about several UN Secretary Generals. I think the most prominent was Boutros Boutros-Ghali in 1994, clarified that the UN Command was more a coalition of armies that was led by the US. And so what role does the UN Command still play in kind of dictating peace or I guess maintaining peace on the Korean Peninsula. And yeah, so I'm just curious, I mean, is that a way for the US to subvert or to kind of go around the Security Council and still kind of maintain this perception of an international body that is, aligned on maintaining a certain set of policy towards North Korea, given that the Russians and the Chinese would unlikely support a military action against the DPRK. So that's my first question.
Okay. You want to answer it straight away, or do you want to ask a question?
I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the UN General Assembly Resolution 3390, if it has any relevance today, if it's a model that could be pursued by the international peace movement to support another General Assembly resolution calling for some kind of diplomatic solution to the current standoff. Mm-hmm. And then the last question I had was about Moon Jae-in and his speech in Germany earlier this summer, where he pledged to sign a peace treaty or to see through a peace treaty. And, whether, I mean, I think your proposal of two separate peace agreements, one between the US and DPRK and another between North and South Korea, seems much more clean cut. But anyway, if you had any thoughts on or response to his basically saying that he would see through a peace treaty. Mm-hmm. So those were my three questions. And then do you want me to ask, should I read the questions that came in? Or
maybe I'll do those three first.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. So on the UNC role today, so the UNC is still around. It's just that it's a shell. In 1950, what it had is operational command of all forces that went Korea to on the side of the ROK. So that meant it had operational control over, for example, Canadians or British contingents or Belgian contingents, whatnot. It also had operational control over the South Korean armed forces at the time, because Lee Sung-man gave it away, basically. Now that that operational control has left, and now that almost all the troops from the member states have left, the UNC basically has no other role than the Military Armistice Commission, where it meets with itself and it lists purported violations of the Armistice Agreement by North Korea. So in that sense, it still considers itself as having a monitoring role. But ambiguity also of it would be a useful lever for the United States in case hostilities were to break out, to ask for assistance from the countries that had originally taken part. So in that sense, from a US perspective, it might seem like there is no benefit in dissolving the UNC, and there's benefit in keeping it around. That is, in my view, reason that the UNC is still around. The next question was about the General Assembly Resolution 3390 in 1985. The circumstances at the time, I think, were such that North Korea could command considerable sympathy in the General Assembly. I don't think that you'll get enough countries that would support it in that would defy basically the approach of the Security Council on Korea in that case, because in 1975 the Security Council didn't say much about Korea. If you had a General Assembly resolution that insisted on a peace treaty without talking about any nuclear weapons, I think that might require so much lobbying that I'm sure it's worth it. But you better ask a UN expert on that. Nevertheless, the reading what 390 formulated is a useful precedent to point out that to basically show that at some point a lot of the General Assembly felt this were reasonable demands. So I think it's more useful as a reference than as a model for action today. But again, you better consult with your experts than me. As for Moon Jae-in and the Berlin speech and trying to make peace, the problem, of course, is that peace with South Korea doesn't resolve from a North Korean perspective the fundamental existential threat, basically, that they think they're facing vis-a-vis the United States. They probably won't think that South Korea will attack them, but they can't be sure for the US. And in that respect, just having a North Korea, South Korea inter-Korean peace agreement without having the same on the US side, I don't see how that makes the North Koreans. You could argue it sense insofar as negotiations proceeded enough on the inter-Korean side, then the US would feel compelled to also be pulled in and make a peace treaty. It's a gamble though, and I don't see the North Koreans doing that gamble because Moon Jae-in has proposed basically inter-Korean military talks, and North Korea has refused those on the basis that South Korea has been supporting non-proliferation against North Korea. So basically, Korea is painting South Korea as being part of the oppressors of their country right now. To have a peace treaty, you need involvement of the United States as well, and to that you need an evolution of the public debate of Korea, in my view. But okay, so those were my quick answers to those questions. But did you identify any other ones?
Here's a few more questions. One is, how have the terms and conditions for reunification changed in the 4 periods highlighted? Given the balance of power geopolitics problem, how viable is it to reorient Korean politics towards non-alignment geopolitics? What are necessary preconditions? And then should I ask another question that came in? Could you elaborate on the political rationale? Okay. Here's the other question is, could you elaborate on the political rational insights behind why reunification and peace treaty were conflated as one goal? So those were some questions. And then there's one more after that. Those are big questions. So I'll let you answer those first.
Yeah. So for non-aligned reunification, I'd want to refer you to my chapter in my book, but the fundamental problem right now for non-aligned reunification is basically that South Korea is not militarily sovereign. If it were militarily sovereign, then it would have a lot more bargaining power vis-a-vis the US and vis-a-vis North Korea. That would mean, in particular, getting back operational control. It would mean developing all the capabilities on which the South Korean armed forces have relied on the US for. Command, control, computers, intelligence, surveillance, all these things. basically the logic in the South Korean armed forces was always that it's not worth it to invest all this money in those areas because the US can do it much better. And there has been a constant tension actually in reform of the Korean army, whether it should be reformed in a way that is self-sufficient or reformed in a way that complements better US capabilities. And if you look at the sort of people that supported the reforms on each side, it's not necessarily as clean-cut as left-right. For example, Park Chung-hee towards the end was very pro-self-reliant forces. Chun-man then pushed it back towards complementarity. And basically you've had a back and forth. Right now, Moon Jae-in is pushing more towards self-reliance. And although he has not, he has started negotiations also for a return of operational control, although to my knowledge, there's not yet a lot of information about the modalities of that. But certainly for South Korea to have unification that's non-aligned, or to have a position that's non-aligned, so that it doesn't get crushed by competition between the US and China, really, and so that it doesn't get always caught up in problems like the FAD with the FAD affair. It's basically caught dilemma because of its military dependence on the United States and its economic dependence on China. The main way to reduce that is basically to diversify your economic portfolio, to not be as dependent on China, and reduce your military dependence on the United States. That's the only way you can really get closer to non-alignment. Why reunification and peace treaty were conflated? I don't know if you can pinpoint a date on that, but probably since the very start of the Korean War, or 1948. Basically, it's just been assumed that as soon as the two Koreas manage to make peace, then that means the conditions are good enough to reunify. It's just that now the two Koreas have grown apart from each other for so long that the two have become, to a certain extent, delinked. If you add, you still have all these surveys in South Korea saying that everybody for reunification, or 70% or 80% are for reunification. But reunification means such different things, different people, that I'm not sure what these numbers mean. Mm-hmm. And to that extent, it may make more sense for North and South Korea to have a phase or a period where they get closer to each other without necessarily putting reunification on the table. I wish it were different, but in that case, the two have grown apart for a very long time. That could be useful. That could be useful taken away for, I don't know, truth and reconciliation commissions or cultural exchanges, or it would take to heal all the wounds, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, here's a question about sanctions.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, there's another question about sanctions, and we have 5 more minutes anyway. But have you studied U.S. sanctions? If so, how would these sanctions laws affect the peace treaty negotiations? Are U.S. officials allowed to meet North Korean officials under the law?
Yeah, U.S. officials are allowed to meet North Korean officials under the law. In fact, they do so. Joseph Yoon was a U.S. official that regularly met with North Korean officials. this year. I don't know if he still does. Probably he does, but he's being quite discreet about it. If it's for reasons of national interest like that, there is no problem with somehow that. As for as for the sanctions that are in place right now, well, there's a whole array of them, and Donald Trump seems to enjoy piling up on them. Like the latest sanctions are, of course, the state sponsor of terrorism sanctions. I'm not sure it really adds anything, but what is more problematic is the sanctions that target banks that do business with North Korea, because, I mean, from North Korean perspective, they're problematic. And that's precisely why the Trump administration uses. That's basically based on the lessons of, again, the Banco Delta Asia affair of 2005, where a Macanese bank was accused of money laundering for North Korea. And even though there were disputes about how much evidence or proof there was for that, it triggered a bank scare insofar as all the customers of Banco Delta, a lot of customers of Banco Delta Asia decided it was too risky to keep their money in there because the bank might be shut off from with the dollar and or the U.S. financial system. And so it ruined the bank. And because of that, a lot of banks felt that it was too risky to business with North Korea, and therefore refused to take any North Korean accounts. That really led to the U.S. To North Korea being a pariah in the international financial system. And that's really linked to the fact that the U.S. is still the most used world currency, and there is no bank that would choose business with North Korea over being shut out of the U.S. financial system.
Mm-hmm.
For North Korea, of course, that makes it very difficult to conduct international trade, and it sees it as a manifestation of hostile intent. So those sanctions probably would be among the first that North Korea would identify as something that it would want gone in case of a peace treaty.
Mm-hmm. Okay. If it's okay, I'm going to ask the last question, which is, so this perception that North Korea is pursuing nuclear weapons in order to use them to fully, I mean, my perception, and as many, is that North Korea is pursuing them as a deterrence against a U.S. preemptive strike. But many believe that North Korea is pursuing the nuclear weapons so that they could use them as to absorb South Korea. And so I'm just curious, I know you wrote about it in your chapter, if you could just elaborate on what has been North Korea's position on acquiring this nuclear capability. And is that perception true, that North Korea is pursuing them in order to absorb the South?
Okay. So, I mean, I cannot read North Korean generals' minds, but it does not make sense to me that you'd want to nuke territories that you want to quote unquote liberate. So North Korean, well, nuclear weapons are not really a good conquest weapon. It makes sense as a deterrent, but for conquest, I don't see how that would work. One aspect that I think often forgotten in the context of North Korean nuclear weapons is that the North Korean military budget, even though we don't have precise figures about that, we know is about $5 billion, or at least the State Department estimated that it was about $4 billion per year between the years 2004 and 2014. So let's round it up to 5 billion for now. By comparison, the South Korean military budget is about 40 billion now. So from the perspective of North Korea, their they're scared that they're going to get attacked. They know they have no chance conquering the South with conventional means. And nuclear weapons are not really going to change that, because it's weapons that are very difficult to use against mobile armies. I mean, it works against things that don't move, but I don't see it being effectively militarily used. Also, it would basically mean suicide. North Korea would be attacked from all sides. So to accuse the side that basically has less military means, less conventional military means, to plot an invasion of the South, I think is something that's just rehashed from the Cold War, and that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense in the current configuration of forces.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'm sure I have plenty more questions, but I'll save them for another time. And I just wanted to thank you so much. You are clearly one of our leading scholars on this issue, and there will be many more opportunities for us to hopefully tap you for your deep knowledge. And so thank you so much, Henri, for joining us today and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you very much
with the community. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining and sticking through. Okay. Good night. Bye-bye.